Ready, thank you. So, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to The Future to Come, a panel discussion between participants in the Guests from the Future and Curator Special Projects section of the Laboratory of the Future. And before I start, I would also like to extend our sympathy to the city of Venice for the tragedy that occurred yesterday. A really sobering moment, so our deepest sympathies to everyone affected. I'd also like to welcome the president, Roberto Cicuto, and his panel, general manager and legal counsel, all of whom are here today. It's great to see you. And as some of you may already know, the aim of the Carnival program, and this is actually the last panel discussion in the series, is to provide an ongoing series of talks, roundtable discussions, performances, and so on, that extend the life of the exhibition beyond the exhibition, bringing the themes into the worlds of discourse, public conversation, and discussion. All our events are filmed and available online shortly after the live event. And I should also say that the audience watching these is actually much larger than the audience in person, which for us, I think those of us from the Global South, this is also a really important moment. So if you haven't been able to see the whole series, they're available on the YouTube channel. I'm delighted to welcome our panelists, some of whom have spent more time getting to Venice than they will spend here. And I'm so grateful to you all for having made the journey from Brazil, the US, and from London/Sweden. Throughout the exhibition, I've made mention of the term the Black Atlantic many times, but I think this is perhaps the one panel that really encapsulates that amazing, dispersed, and shared culture between Africa, the Caribbean, Europe, and the Americas, both North and South. So I'm just going to introduce the panelists quite briefly. So Yolande Daniels is the founder of Studio Sumo West in Los Angeles and a co-founding design principal of Studio Sumo in New York. The work of her studio ranges from institutional and cultural projects in education and the arts to housing at multiple scales in the US and abroad. Her independent design research explores the spatial effects of race and gender in the built environment, focusing on the narratives of resistance and autonomy. In particular, her work takes as a focus documenting and representing spaces that have been rendered adjunct to, yet supplement and maintain, dominant spatial and political systems of power. Margarida, and I'm not introducing everybody in the order in which they're seated, so you might just wave to the audience. Margarida Waco is an architect whose work lies at the intersection of research, publishing, and curating. Originally from Angola, she has lived in the Democratic Republic of Congo, France, Denmark, and Sweden. She formerly headed the strategic outreach of the Funambulist magazine. She is a tutor at the Royal College of Art, where she convenes the architectural design studio ADS8, Anatomies of Ecological Bodies, alongside Imani Jacqueline Brown and Miriam Shabani, who is also a participant in the exhibition. Reka August Nelson is a designer of protective housing, you can just wave, encompassing secret compartments, hidden rooms, and escape mechanisms. She received both her BA and MArch from Harvard in 2018, trained in furniture making at the North Bennett Street School. She's a superintendent with Consigli Construction Company. She's from New York City. So welcome. The collective Cartografia Negra emerged to think, revisit, learn about, and give new meaning to historical Black narratives and territories in Sao Paulo, places of resistance or spaces that were used for the sale, torture, or execution of enslaved people, and that today have names and meanings that erase these stories and even contradict them. Pedro Alves worked at the Sao Paulo State Department of Culture in 2014 and 2015. He is part of the Revista Vaidapé, and now you have to excuse my bad Portuguese. Media Collective has published a book of poetry and collaborates with the art collective Dream Acting, which organizes performances that are broadcast in Germany, Australia, Brazil, Belgium, and Spain. Carolina Vieira has a degree in journalism and has worked in the communication field since 2013. She was a reporter at Página B, the new portal of Revista Brasileiros, and at Revista Vaidapé, alongside Pedro, an independent media outlet in Sao Paulo. Her work appears in various publications in Brazil and internationally. She's also an actress and production technician, using her voice to spotlight issues such as violence against women. And Raíssa Albano de Oliveira has a degree in social sciences from the Pontifical Catholic University of Sao Paulo. She is a researcher in, as she calls it, constant transformation, relating theoretical knowledge with daily life and needs. Within Cartografia Negra, she develops urban intervention projects with a theoretical basis on points that are related to the Black experience in the city of Sao Paulo. So a huge welcome to all of you again, and thank you for making this incredibly challenging journey. And I'm deeply interested in your versions of practice and hope that by framing your descriptions of the way you work, why you work the way you work, and why you do what you do, what has led to, or we could say this has led to a more expansive view of architecture. And the framing for this discussion states that there are 3 mistakes that people commonly make when thinking about the future. The first is to think that nothing will change, that everything will remain the same. The second is to assume that everything will change and that nothing will stay as it is. And the third and most dangerous mistake of all is not to think about the future. So I want to start by asking from left to right, do you agree? Yolande.
Okay. Thank you for that great introduction. It's really wonderful to be on the panel with everyone else. And so regarding practice and the future, I think I love the way that you laid out the question. I think it's maybe like to start thinking about the future. For me, it's that what I'm doing right now, today, is impacting the future. So all of our actions today are producing the future in some way. And so I think in my practice, I've come to understand the future by looking at the past, like looking at historical events in the past that have that relate to either women's histories or to the histories of Blacks in the United States, but also in other countries, and the way that those histories are implanted into the cities that we dwell in without, our acknowledgement of it. So this idea that the future is embedded in the present, but it's also embedded in the past is something that I've kind of come to just really understand through my practice.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I can ask the same question of Pedro, yeah.
Hi. Hi, hello everyone. First of all, I really need to say thank you to Lesley and all Biennale keep to make this possible, to travel to Brazil from here and talking in this theater, and say and apologize for my English. My English is really, really bad, but I can understand and speak. If you don't understand something, ask it to me. But in the practice who we make in Brazil, as a Black man in Brazil, it's very, very difficult to think about the future. Really difficult because the violence, so much problems to our people in my country, in our country. But our work needs to revisit the past, looking, research in the past, to learning what our communities do to make the survivor can be, make the lives, make the all happy things we can do. But it's so difficult to think a long time to the future because my English in Portuguese I really much smart in Portuguese. It's difficult to me.
But I think this idea that the future is quite painful, it's...
No necessarily painful, but it's difficult to think because all these possibilities in the future pass to the violence, to the make more and more and more, 200% more, and so difficult to carry this weight, you know, next.
Yeah. No, there's Germaine Barnes's piece in the exhibition, just in the Arsenale, is this column that weighs 6,000 pounds, and it's about the heaviness of both the past and the present. So there's a kind of physicality about the past that I think you also, it comes across in the way you speak. Yeah.
That is the word, heavy. It's so heavy, you know.
Yeah. Rebecca.
Hello. Like they were saying, thank you again for inviting us here and allowing us to meet each other and have this conversation. Getting into the idea of future, I think that when we formed our practice, we didn't see a lot of people like us asking the questions we were asking, looking for collaboration in the same way. So I think implicitly, we don't know what the future looks like because we don't really have visibly similar mentors or role models. I think we're excited at the prospect of doing something new, and so it's with a certain optimism that we look forward because we've been able to come together.
I think I would say that judging from the comments that I've had about the exhibition as a whole, there are two sentiments that keep emerging, and they're almost polar opposites. One is about the heaviness of the past and what we've come out of, and the other is about the brightness of a future that's just in front. So that it's a kind of a yin and yang in a way. What did you say?
Hi, okay. Yeah, I got it now. Yeah. Okay, so thank you, Lesley. Thank you, everybody. So thinking about the future, I think that I've been thinking about this panel, and I remembered a quote from Milton Santos, who was a geographer. Okay, so I'm sorry about my English too.
It's better than my Portuguese, don't worry.
Okay, so, but he was a really important man in São Paulo. In Brazil, actually, he was from Bahia, Chapada Diamantina. It's in the interior of Bahia. And he wrote a sentence that is, the world is made not only about what already exists, but of what can effectively exist. Mm-hmm. Did you get it? Mm-hmm. Okay, so, and Milton Santos also thought about territory in geography when he was working. People would only consider that geography was physical structures and physical places and only consider physical aspects. So if there was mountains or not, and then he began to think about people in these territories. And he thinks about the territory, thinking about its dreams, so the dreams that the people who lives in this territory has, and the desires. So when I read about future, thinking about this panel, I remembered this quote, because now we have an exhibition in São Paulo about Milton Santos, who which has a typography project of Francine Moura, who is an architect there in São Paulo too. And I thought about this quote, you know, like the future as something that we can create. Sorry. But just to complement something that Pedro was saying, and that comes in contradiction with that somehow, is about genocide of black people in Brazil, like genocide of black men especially. So this is why also is really hard and heavy to think about future. You know, in Brazil, it's not only this genocide, but there is also a lot of violences that keep updating. So, like, since the person is born, a non-white person will suffer probably more. So we have these updates of slavery. So thinking about future is also something that puts us to think, you know, because we see the past, and with our collective we think a lot about the past, but we are also always thinking about how it updates in our reality in a lot of forms, including in the city. So this is it, I guess, for this.
I mean, I think it's the South African writer, I think her last name is Haffajee, who writes about how in societies that are undergoing incredible tensions, one way to escape the tension is to project into the future. So in places that have a very complicated or contested past, all of your ambition, your desire, your hope goes into the future, which is also dangerous in a way. What would you say, Margarida?
I also want to thank you profoundly for this wonderful invitation. I would say that this South African writer that you just brought up kindly very much resonate with my thinking as well. There is this, in my understanding, you know, to think about futures might be a luxury to some, but I also deeply believe that futures are constantly being performed, created, made, remade in various forms, and I guess for someone with so essentially my piece here presented at the Biennale looks into those particular questions. It's located in a small region called Cabinda, in which most of the oil extraction is happening to funnel extractive wealth in Angola. And somehow, you know, these societies in constant tension, or these toxic atmospheres that somehow surround our entire existence and beings, and to think through that. So of course it departs from, you know, from an inquiry into the enduring suffering, but it also attempts to look into ways in which we might allow ourselves to think differently about our existence in this world. And one particular thing that I came to realize is that all of this is happening in micro scales. You know, it's daily micro tactics that are constantly happening. That somehow, you know, without falling into the trap and fear of theorizing these contradicting acts, I still believe that it's somehow, you know, a projection onto possible futures. Find ways of, you know, creating what Christina Sharp might call microclimates. Microclimates that becomes these small daily acts of resistance to escape the toxic climates in which we find ourselves.
There's I imagine that the same word exists in Italian, but I could be wrong, that in French there are two words for the future. One is le futur, which you could say is the kind of known future, and the other word is l'avenir, which is really about a future that is to come. So there's two forms of future in a way. And one of the things that I think has been very exciting about seeing the work in the Biennale is, to me, that speaks to the future that is to come. It's not really the future that was planned, particularly for architecture. So there's a kind of energy embodied in work that has come out of this very traumatic past that is full of a lot of hope, I think. Would you agree?
Hi everybody. I want also thank for this, to be in this table, for this invitation. My English is very bad also. And I was hearing you and hearing you now and thinking about how time and thinking, looking for time like something that is going on all the time. And we have a thinker, intellectual in Brazil, who is slave now, who calls Nego Bispo, and he says, begin, middle, begin. So all these things that happened in the past that we as cartography, we study, and it's very hard because we are talking about kidnapping, we are talking about murder, we are talking about violence, but we're also thinking about how these people dream, because every people dream, you know, and we are looking for this, and hearing you thinking about this future there is right now. We are here, we don't dreaming about being here with these people that we admire the work and being a Biennale. So it's our ancestors' dreams, but it's also ours, and could be our sons' dreams also.
It's so interesting. I think of something like the Aboriginal creation myth, which I think in their language is called the dreaming, that the world was dreamed into existence. And this idea that I think it was you who was saying that the physical world is not the only world that's out there. There are other worlds that are equally spatial. And perhaps to bring this, and I think one of the criticisms about the Biennale has been all along, where is the architecture? So I want to bring this conversation back towards practice, because I think that relationship between architecture as a discipline and architecture as a practice are two slightly different things. They are interconnected, but they're not the same. So in terms of your future practice as an architect, how do you think you will practice? And this is to anybody. Like, how would you describe yourself as an architect of the future?
I'll try to answer. So let's see, architect of the future.
Like, in other words, what is it that you do in your practice that manifests?
Well, I mean, I feel like even without the invitation to be here, which was very great, in my practice, I am constantly working toward the future. I do think it's working toward the future, but in order to understand the ground that I'm standing on, the conditions that we inherited, I've had to look back. But I'm here, I'm projecting forward, and I want to make alternatives for the future. But I have found that I really had to understand, I just had to study more and understand why and how things came to be. And then what I've found is that by looking back in history, one sees patterns. And, and there is, I thought what you said about the two definitions of the future in French was very interesting because we don't have that in English, or there's just the future. But the idea that there are like foreseeable future events. But then there are unforeseeable future events, but you can also, so you can predict that certain things may happen, and then there are other things that you can't predict, like COVID, or maybe that could have been predicted by some people who were more in the know than the rest of us, that it was bound to happen. But, so I think, yeah, in terms of the practice, what I find, though, is that having to deal with the ground, having to deal with, the conditions that we've inherited as Black inhabitants, as people of the African diaspora, that's a lot of work. It spends a lot of labor, and there's a term like emotional labor, that kind of goes into that as well. And there's this, the essay by, her name escapes me right now, but as you were talking about the heaviness and this kind of labor that you're doing in Cartografia Negra in Brazil, which people have done, continues in other places and happened in America at one point more actively at different times. Like one of the strategies of oppression is to have Black people, oppressed people, so busy trying to solve the problem that they didn't create, that they can't actually move into the future. Because it's just, the day-to-day is so consuming. But I do think, the future is in the present, but then looking at the past, what I found are like seeing these cycles. So the project I'm working on now is trying to look at these cycles and kind of look at the ones that I can see that are going to happen again, like, for example, the civil rights movement in the 1960s in the United States. There was a civil rights movement in the United States in the 1860s. That's when the Civil War happened there, when slaves were emancipated, 1860s, 1870s. And so then I became curious about the 1760s. If you look back, what's there? There's a similar kind of revolution, but it's actually like more global. And so then projecting forward, we're moving toward the 2060s. Based on this pattern, there would be a kind of revolution somewhere that deals with civil rights. And of course, Africa was part of that too in the 1960s, 1970s, and post-colonialization. So that's like a pattern that you can see. But then thinking about things that are more, like in architecture, what are the architectural patterns, the spatial patterns, the things that affect cities? Those are the questions I'm trying to ask, because they're a little bit less clear, more amorphous than like civil rights patterns.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I use that word so often I sound like a broken record, but one of the givens about architecture, anyone practicing architecture, is that it is predictable, so that you make a drawing or a model or a simulation about something that's going to be built, and the gap between what you draw and what you make must be as narrow as possible. Once the building stands, what happens to it when the user comes in is a completely different conversation, but your skill as the architect is to narrow that gap. And yet in the histories that we are talking about and the experiences and the kind of cultural threads, it's all about the opposite of certainty. It's all about lost memory, about silence, about fragmented experiences. And so there's this strange tension between the collective interest and this discipline or subject that we're trying to bring these interests to. And I wonder sometimes is that why the future is such an important site, because it gives you time and space to figure out how to make that translation.
First, I am not an architect, but in Brazil, architecture can be a action verb, arquitetar, who say create and make these things possible, you know. And I have in my mind something to say, but here I forget one thing. But in our work, we research in the past to learn, and we never forget that when we all thinking about the future, Black people, indigenous peoples, every people in the world thinking future can be a different future, because we have our dreams, we have our plans, and so much things we think about this future. But the colonizer, the other side, the biggest capitalist and all these peoples have it, they dream, the dreams of theirs about this future, you know. And we need to know, to have a knowledge about these things, about our things, about our dreams. In the Cartografia Negra, we work in the city about the why make this building, why this city put to the underground a lot of rivers. In São Paulo have a lot of rivers to be in underground, and the city always when rain, the cities go to a big
Flood.
Yeah, the water come to the houses, and the poor people and mostly Black people who lives in situations of the mountains, of the valleys, in all kind of living rooms and our houses, suffering about these things, because one group of people who born for these colonizers think the city just for there, not to the all people. And to think the future, we need to know then other people think other futures, and how we can build together, we can fight through these things, how we can organize in us, you know, I think this.
You want to say something, Rebecca?
Sorry. I was really interested to hear you talk about cycles. I think that that's at the heart of how we've been practicing. It's almost as if we're pacing ourselves. I think we lean on the term riff because there's something unfinished implicit there, and I think that we're practicing and trying to make things better, and in a way acknowledging that change is going to be incremental. It can sometimes be overwhelming, but I think at the same time it allows us to pick it up as a day-to-day responsibility that flows into other parts of who we are, because some of the futures that we consider are very big and hugely impactful, but also just living in the world and having these more trivial concerns that supplement us all to be kind to each other, to finish your day. I think that we've focused on our process as being one that's highly iterative in order to give us the stamina to keep chipping away.
It's interesting. I mean, if I think on the answers that you've all, or the responses that you've all given, there's something in there about patterns, about things being repeated. There's something in there about uncovering stories that have been silenced. There's something in there about chipping away. These are quite interesting metaphors, I think, for thinking about how to build, to create, to think in a more just and sustainable and inclusive way. And these are very, very large tropes. I mean, when you talk about a just world, a just or a environmental justice, it's a huge topic. And yet the tools that you're talking about are really incremental tools, small patterns, micro climates, and so on. Do you think there's something at odds between the scale of operation and the kind of the threat of the future?
I will try to answer. I don't know if I got it all, but we worked as a collective. We worked as curators of Biennale International of Architecture in São Paulo last year. So there we also faced a lot of critics from a lot of architects that were saying that they were not seeing models and they weren't seeing a lot of projects in the Biennale. So if we were doing like social science seminary or panel, because that wasn't about architecture. So some points that got to us was that was about these erased narratives of some groups in particular. So there were a lot of people talking about Black architects, for example, that are not as visible in a lot of universities in São Paulo, at least, especially in USP. So University of São Paulo, one of the biggest universities from South America and Latin America. And we also faced a lot of queries about accessibility, you know, in the exhibition space, and also thinking about architecture. So how much architects think about accessibility and how much does it cost, because it's really expensive, like it's really expensive, you got it. So there is something also thinking about future and thinking about this practice that we've been talking about and that we've been invited to talk about, even though we are not architects. But since we began working together, a lot of architects came closer and we began to talk about memory and think about the memory and the archive of the city of São Paulo, and not only of São Paulo, but nowadays of other places too.
But I suppose the question I'm trying to get to is that at this point in time, I think we can no more say that questions of race, gender, identity, history, migration don't matter 20 years ago, you might have been able to say in architectural discourse that these things are outside. I think it's almost impossible to argue that now. But the tools that we might use for a future practice that involves these questions, if the tools of architecture are not sufficient for the task, what are the tools that we need now? So you talk about moving into social sciences or into journalism or into art or into poetry. And I'm wondering, does that mean fundamentally that the tools of the architect will change?
I can try to go, and then we can I can try to open this. So essentially, I deeply believe that architecture is an inherently relational discipline. I think it leans on so many knowledge systems, and I think we need to acknowledge that. But also, I'm very much interested in the kind of, in the notion of productivity somehow. How does it become productive somehow? Oh, sorry. And one of the things that I am contemplating, and also something that we just recently launched with a course that I'm teaching, is essentially, exactly looking into all these matters or questions around race and gender and all sorts, but from a somehow, very material, but also very spatial perspective. So for instance, one of the things that we are interested in is to understanding, understanding materials, the attributes, the properties, both chemical and technical and mechanical, and also understanding where those come from, most specifically. Because I guess also in the pursuit or in the somehow, this narrative, prevailing narrative of the green transition, we also tend to kind of forget that that such materials that we, for instance, use in the industry have been attributed these, these terms, but then what happens at the site, at the time, in the geographies of the production. So we're looking into specifically what Gomez, I forget her name now, defined as sacrifice zones. And again, so sacrifice zone, territory, sites, geographies that are somehow, that hold matter and communities, bodily communities that are sacrificed to the logic of profit, of development, of progress. So I somehow think it starts to kind of intersect, and in a sense to kind of make it a bit more productive, because we have very, very precise architecture tools. In my practice, I use climate calculations. I look into life cycle analysis and studies. So I try to understand the very particular components and attributes. But what we tend to forget is the other end of the production cycle, the supply chains. So in terms of the scale and in terms of scales of operation, I do believe that architecture have some kind of agency to take on those very heavy topics. Sorry.
I'm going to say, lots of people have asked me over the course of maybe 20, 30 years what it was like to be a student of architecture interested in these topics, but not have let's say, the tools to immediately be able to say, this is what I'm doing. It was very exploratory. But studying at the Bartlett in the late 80s and early 90s, one of the things that was very remarkable about the school was that it was a very confident school. It was a school that was very assured of its own position, which made it very generous. And it meant that you could bring anything to the school from wherever. And the school was robust enough not to push it away, to bring it in. And I often think about architecture as a profession being the complete opposite of that its first instinct is always defensive, that this is not architecture, this is. That can't be architecture because that is. So there's something about generosity, and I think you talked about care and maybe empathy, these slightly warmer attributes that the profession could really use. And that might be a form of future practice, a different kind of practice. Would you agree?
In the US, architect in and of itself is a very protected term. I'm not entirely sure how it operates here in Europe, but for the last several years since graduating from school, I have legally been required to self-describe as a designer, and I originally carried that with a little bit of embarrassment because I went to architecture school. I'm supposed to be an architect. But as I've been working in construction, I've started to, I think, carry more pride in the designer moniker versus architect because, like you said, architect, it's very protected, but it also is isolated from other knowledges. In order to sort of protect professionals, it has to push away a lot of responsibilities and thoughtfulness and put it onto other people, which I think can limit it greatly. So I think for me, I've stepped back from wanting to be a capital A architect and say, no, I'm a designer. That means that I'm taking responsibility not only for a product, but for a process, because anyone can be a designer without a degree, anyone can be a builder without a degree, and I think those terms are what I see myself going into the future with.
So, would you say that there's a kind of, because one of the things that always happens when you get onto a panel to talk about architecture, and this is not just this panel, but we all lament what architecture is. There's a kind of sense that it has let us down in a way. That's certainly my feeling. But would you say that right now there is a sense of ownership over what architecture can be, even if it's not within your own practice, but from seeing the work of others? Do you feel the sense of optimism now? Oh, okay. No, go, Adi.
I'm an anthropologist, and it's very, I would say, funny, because we are a collective with known architects thinking about architects, but this was not so clear for us, because in anthropology we think about the people, we think about how the people live, what they dream, how they be in the world, but architecture now I think about the space, and this is so related. And I think social science and architecture has to be together, because people need space to live, and in Brazil we have most of the constructions don't have architectures. The people build for themselves and don't have any documentation, and still there and works. And these spaces just make sense with the people who live in. And in Brazil, it's a very difficult subject thinking about architecture, because mostly architecture in Brazil is made for white men, for everybody in Brazil. In Brazil, we are most black people. And the architecture of Brazil, Oscar Niemeyer, keeps very dissociated by the living of the people, the culture of the people. So I see one possibility to think architecture in the future, in the present, right now, it's thinking with social science and literature and arts, because life doesn't go in separate boxes. Life happens all the time, everything. Just want to add this.
Can I also answer? Because I think your answer answered the question well, in that, like, there isn't one, there are maybe like multiple policing factions of architecture. So, you know, one of it is professionalization. So, you know, the term architect is guarded under the guise of professionalization and safety, life safety. But then there's also academic policing of architecture, which is a totally different thing. So the critique that there's not enough architecture in the Biennale comes from that policing. And I think it relates to the idea that, you know, architecture shouldn't be burdened with all of the social issues, right? And there may be other policing as well that's happening, but those seem to be the two major ones. And I think, you know, the question of tools, it's something that I'm thinking a lot about. And the person whose name I couldn't remember was Audre Lorde, who wrote about tools, who, you know, thought about tools, and she, you know, her famous quote about the master's tools cannot be used to dismantle the master's house, which was a criticism of first wave or second wave white women feminists who didn't actually have liberating practices toward, you know, Black people and other minorities in their pursuit of freeing themselves. But I've been thinking about that in terms of architecture, and, you know, the essay that you gave us to read by Achille Membe, there was something he wrote about practices. I wrote it down so I wouldn't forget it. Pedagogies of presence. And he wrote about tools too, but I was thinking about how with the way that we teach kind of after modernism is through abstraction. And I've noticed with African American students, many of them struggle with abstraction. And abstraction is kind of like ground zero. It's like the thing that we all learn. We live it, we breathe it, we don't even think about it. It's part of my practice. But I think when we try to think outside of abstraction, because I've had conversations with other faculty about this, the alternatives that we come up with are narrative. They're not architecture, you know, but we're not actors, so narrative isn't quite it, but I think we do need to think of other alternatives. And then the way you described how we were talking about our practices in terms of chipping away or these kind of like small actions, and you asked if they were sufficient, you know, for the scale of the crises or the scale of what needs to be done. And in some ways, I think they are precisely what we need, right? So it's not the kind of big heroic gesture. It's more like the smaller, continuous, rhythmic wearing away, like the way water wears away a stone, or the way a lot of earth processes happen. There are the big cataclysmic earth processes, but most of nature is just this constant kind of changing, tweaking, you know, like with COVID again, it was really interesting to see how fast nature took over in places when man kind of stepped away, you know, from the environment. And now, of course, you know, we've kind of gone back and taken over these places that had started to become wild, but it happened very quickly. And so I do think that maybe there is something about the small-scale practices. And then, the question that I've been asking myself is, well, the practices that define, and this isn't architecture, this is just thinking about the supply chain of architecture, the practices that define it are extraction, expansion, these are things that have to do with climate change, actually, but they're part of the architecture supply chain. We extract resources. There's always the idea that we have to expand to get more land, more resources. We have to own it, ownership. Value is attributed first by finding something that isn't valued, so then you can make a profit off of it. So trying to think of the ways that, the tools that work right now, and then how can we think of tools opposite from that. And so the same thing with architecture, because expansionist, extractive principles have guided architecture. How do we rethink that in our discipline?
It's such a fantastic response, and I mean, in a way, that's kind of what I was looking for, is that the scale of operation. I love the metaphor of the way water chips away at something, that the personality of architecture is avaricious. It gobbles almost everything in its past. It gobbles resources and manpower and labor and energy and so on, but a different kind of practice, a much, dare I say, it's slower, incremental practice, might in the end change the nature of architecture. And I think that's actually the big scale question that we're all asking, is can we practice in the way that we have been trained and expect to see a change? I think not. And perhaps part of what all of this, these discussions, the exhibition, the Carnival program itself, is a way of asking, how is it possible to do it differently? How literally do we translate a different attitude towards the environment, towards each other, towards history, towards the future? That has to be learned and taught and practiced. But if we can't name it, we can't articulate it, we can't see it, we're forever condemned to talk in kind of generalities. And in a way, this has been an attempt to talk specifically about what are the moves in the future that we have to make. And everybody talks about climate change being a kind of scientific challenge. Actually, it's a cultural challenge. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree everything, but we think no. In this world, in this modern world, when and where everything is everything, all these disciplines, people, culture are very mixed by the globalization and these things. I will repeat a lot of words, but it's impossible to think the architecture like one box, or all the disciplines like one box. All these things may have to talking with each other. We say these conflicts in the Biennale of São Paulo. So much architecture defend this professionalization. How you say I think the tool of the architecture can use to make a better future possible, is to listen all disciplines, listen all people, because one kind of work who defines cities, defines living houses, rivers, and all these structures never can think it by herself. Need to talking with the all thoughts, all people who have something to put together in this discussion. You know, I don't know if I was clear.
I understand what you're saying, because I relate it to just like in America, African Americans in neighborhoods where they're disenfranchised from their surroundings, where they don't control their surroundings, right? Because others, you know, the city, other authorities come and basically build the buildings and, you know, make the rules, but the people who live there, they live through the results, right? So like a similar thing in the United States to the pipes that you were talking about being put under the poorer neighborhoods and then they flood when it rains. It's not flooding, but you know, the way highways were used in the United States, they were put strategically through poor neighborhoods, and through thriving black neighborhoods, and they dismantled a lot of black neighborhoods by doing that. Very, you know, neighborhoods that there were all kinds of neighborhoods, but some that were, you know, thriving and some that were maybe struggling, and they just, you know, it was the path of least resistance to just put the highway through someone else's neighborhood.
I mean, one of the things that really struck me when I worked in South Africa was this kind of tension between the early modernists in South Africa who left in the sort of 40s, 50s, 60s, most of whom studied abroad, so they went to the United States, some of them went to Brazil, they came to Europe. And architecture was quite avant-garde, you know, the kind of really thinking about the future, quite socialist in its agenda. And then those architects had to come back to a country that did the complete opposite, that used architecture primarily as a tool of suppression. So there was something in the discipline itself in South Africa that was very unresolved, very, I used to think of it like a kind of wound. And every time you pressed an architect in South Africa too much, literally blood would appear. It was a very, very tense kind of situation. And it made me think about the image of the architect as always being someone who builds for the better, that the proposition is always to make a better world. But actually the truth of it is, many times it is not at all. So there's a kind of discrepancy in a way. And maybe the conversation around tools is really about tactics and processes rather than the actual tool. And that there's something more generous in the idea of a tactic or the way that you might approach a brief or a building or a project that allows it to be more open-ended, which I think is the opposite of what most architects do. You get the brief and you execute the brief. It's not really a question. I'm going to ask if there's any questions from the audience. And it can take a little minute to formulate a question.
So thank you for being here and welcome to the Biennale and to Venice. It was very, very interesting. But Lesley mentioned before some criticism which have been addressed to the fact that some people don't see architecture, actual buildings in this exhibition. I'm so happy about that because this is the reason I choose her. But I would like to hear from you if you had time to visit the exhibition, the Mostra di Architettura. What did you get? For us, European, white people, intellectuals, let's call themselves ourselves like this, I shared a feeling with so many other people that for the first time we heard something we didn't know, pretending that we knew about what we were watching in these exhibitions. So, as I made with Lesley, I made another choice, inviting the next curator for art from Brazil, because what is important for me is not just to be politically correct and give the word to people, which is true. Usually they don't have found their place in the main table, as Lesley said 2 years ago, but to have a different point of view, another perspective. I have been someone who has been working in cinema for many, many years, so I want the camera to be put on the other way, on the other side of the room. Did you feel watching this exhibition, you who come from the other side of the room, that this can be got from the audience, or what you have found, if you did, different in this exhibition from other architecture exhibitions? Thank you.
I can try to start actually, and I think also this somehow relates to what Yolande and Lesley, your end points, because there is this somehow, you know, urgency to also think, you know, architectural practice or material practice in relation to larger societal issues, and I think to some extent this is really what's at stake here. This is really what is displayed here at the Biennale, and then also there is this question of, you know, plurality and hybridity, and this idea of, you know, of course leaning on other disciplines to somehow further these inquiries, or further you know, present the diversity or the body of works presented there. I think many of us kind of, you know, succumb to video-based work, also kind of to respond to the overall framework that was set up with decarbonization, and kind of, you know, attempting not to bring physical forms to the Biennale, but yeah, I think this was just a starting point, and we can circle back. But these were my first reflections on what you said. But thank you for the question.
I could jump in. So I was here earlier today, walking around. I was here yesterday too, and I saw things that I hadn't seen. I thought I'd seen everything when I came. When I came in May to do the installation, go through the openings, and yesterday I saw things I hadn't seen, and today I saw more. So it's been really wonderful, and I actually feel like I should. I feel very thankful. Because today what I saw was, I looked more closely at the Slovenia pavilion, and it was all about vernacular architecture. And as you were speaking about building in Brazil, where, you know, there's the building for the majority population, but then there's the majority of building that is generally not considered architecture, but it's the majority of building. It kind of resonated with vernacular architecture. And so, okay, why am I thankful? I'm thankful because I am teaching an integrated building design class because I build buildings, but most of my work is about space and cities and laws that, you know, make the city act the way it does, and how that relates to our social laws. But this vernacular building exhibit was talking about kind of like pre-HVAC and air conditioning techniques that people had to keep warmth in a home, or to just really interesting, inventive ways of approaching architecture, thinking about, without thinking about a monoculture, so not separating architecture from everything else, not separating people from animals or from nature, And these are maybe strategies or tools that were part of how people operated in the past that we can revisit for today. And these are strategies that can help us with climate change. So I was actually really happy to find this because I have to teach this, even though it's something I'm just learning about. But it made me value vernacular ways, older, alternative ways of looking at architecture, even though we're all looking at the future. But thinking about how, those older practices, rethinking life without air conditioning, how you can kind of move forward in the future. So that was one thing that I saw that just really resonated with me, I guess, just personally. But then also, I think that all of the work together, like just so many, and I guess every Biennale is like this, like just so many, so much thoughtfulness going into the life of architecture, but the life of architecture today. So another exhibit was looking at working conditions and basically like oppression within the field of architecture. Like, how do you maintain a practice? Do you work overtime? How do you have a child and have a practice? Like these things that actually made me question the way that I practice. I could say somewhat uncomfortably, it's like, how is architecture sustainable? That was basically what it was asking. And I think in many ways, going throughout the show, that question is asked in different ways. And I hope, like just from the comments, Lesley, and the questions you've asked us, that, we're able to think of alternative, sustainable ways that value all voices, that, that don't kind of build for one population at the expense of another. And I think that so many voices in this show are about that.
It's really a great question, but I'm going to name drop here, but I took a very famous filmmaker around the exhibition about 3 weeks ago, African-American filmmaker, and I was expecting it to be a 45-minute quick kind of tour, and it was about 4 hours long. And when we walked in the entrance in the Arsenale, her producer read the inscription in the blue room, and I pulled everybody through and was talking about Lionheart and the exhibits. And then I noticed that 2 or 3 of the group had stayed back in the blue room. So I stopped and waited, and 5 minutes goes past, and 10 minutes goes past. So eventually I thought, well, I better go and see what is holding her up. And she was in the corner of the blue room crying. And she said, I have never seen my people valued in this way. And she hadn't actually gone in the exhibition yet. But there was something about the value that the Biennale had given what she thought of as her story that she had never seen valued in that way before. And so there was a kind of joy, I think, at seeing the work. And that's only the first step, in the same way that to be angry is only the first step. What comes after is the real test, and I think we're somehow still too close to it. I think for me, the real value of this show will come in 5 years' time, not now. Yeah. Thank you. Any other questions? Okay, so I'm going to ask one last question. On our program, we said it was from 3 to 5, but I know that a 2-hour panel discussion is more than most people can bear. So one of my favorite questions to students has always been, what kind of architect or what kind of practitioner do you want to be?
that's difficult to me and to us of Cartografia Negra because we are not architecture.
But practitioner.
How kind practice I can be.
What kind of practice? What kind of... To me, it doesn't really matter whether you're a qualified architect or you're working in the field of architecture. To me, they're very, very similar. And your work is deeply historical and architectural and urban. So what kind of practitioner?
Our work in Brazil, we work together about a lot of lawyers about rights to the city. You know, rights to the city, because we think in this ancestor city, in the people to build in these constructions, because we thought we say about no architecture and build these things, but we know the people have some knowledge, some tools to make these and to learn from the past to transmit to the future, because how Raíssa says is a dream to us, before was a dream to our ancestors, and in the future become a dream to our, I don't know this word, the people who, os próximos, amiga. No. Successors is, yes. And in my work, in our work, is this is the center, you know, to put together all these things and to project to the future, to people who go to in this future, who study what we make in this time, to can go further, go more and more, you know.
There's a really beautiful film by the Chilean filmmaker Patricio Guzmán. It's called Nostalgia for the Light. And it's about the large array telescopes in the Atacama Desert, which has no humidity. So in that space on Earth, they can see the most into space. But when you look at space, you're also looking at time, because light takes time to travel. And he makes this really interesting point in the film that Chile can look 2 billion years into its past, but it can't look 20. So there's something about the scale of time which is also really important. So in a way, I see many of you as kind of, not time travelers, but people who are deeply interested in time and architecture. Yeah. So it's a great answer.
Well, I guess when I think about the future, which was a different prompt you gave us, I hope that's okay that I'm bringing it up, but you asked if there was one word we would use to describe the future, and for me, the word is long, and it really ties back into what Yolande was saying about resiliency, or endurance, sorry. But basically, trying to understand how to keep practicing, to keep with those moves, those small-scale moves, in order to set the stage for the next people, in order to pull people with you. And I think that we talk about burnout a lot in graduate school because it does happen, and I think that's obviously because of sort of how we're taught to think about architecture, but I think that's maybe one of the greatest risks with how it's currently practiced, is that I think the people who might bring in the greatest amount of change for the better are the ones who exit first. That's what I saw in school. So I'm just trying to stay in it.
But it's also a great analogy. I mean, you use the word burn out. I mean, we think about it as one word, but there's a kind of combustion, there's a kind of energy association in it. And that it's not tension, but that relationship between small-scale moves that can keep you in the game for a long time is a sort of nod to the resilience that it takes to make change. So I enjoy these metaphors of almost cataclysmic change and huge amounts of energy, and then this sustained, more thoughtful, more kind of careful, long-term approach. Yeah, it's interesting.
So when I hear you, I think also about strategy. And in Brazil, we used to have a lot of quilombos, and we still have it. Raisa mentioned Nego Bispo, and he's a quilombola. That's how we call. So we have a name for quilombos in English. I can't.
It's a dance. Quilombo? No.
It's the same. Quilombo. It's the same.
Is it a dance? No.
No.
Spaces of resistance.
Ah, okay.
That's a long story, but when we were enslaved, people can run away and stay in these places, in these territories, and create a new society.
Yep.
In these places. We have many in Brazil, and some territories still are up today, like where Nego Bispo lives.
Okay. So I think it's also in the Caribbean that you had slaves who escaped and who formed other republics, other territories outside of the control of slavery, I guess. And this is Quilombo.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, we have a lot of types of quilombos. So we have like urban quilombos and rural quilombos, and nowadays we have contemporary quilombos. So some of them are not from the slavery time, but it's still called quilombo. So I was thinking about that as a strategy, you know,
Yeah.
to a strategy of resilience and of organization. And I also thought about what kind of practitioner I want to be. And when I think about it, I think about people who came before us. And I think about Francine Moura that I mentioned, that is an architect, a Brazilian architect who made this ethnographic project of Milton Santos' exhibition, and who also made part of the construction of a monument of Joaquim Pinto de Oliveira, who was an architect who lived in São Paulo in the 18th century, and he made the first fountain with water that you can drink in São Paulo. And she made his monument. I think about her, and I think about Joyce Birch, who wrote a book thinking about how cities are phallocentric as well. And I think about quilombos, and the old quilombos and the quilombos that still exist in Brazil. And I also think about this way of thinking about communities, you know, and this empathy that you say, and also about ethics, you know, thinking about Paulo Freire and bell hooks, thinking about education in high education, you know. Bell hooks brings a lot of it, dialoguing with Paulo Freire, right? Thinking about the ethic with people around you, and this multicultural world, and how we can keep going with it, considering the climate changes as well, and this culture as well. In São Paulo nowadays, we are having a wide change of temperature. It's crazy, and we are looking at El Niño, but it's not only because of that. Like, we've never seen what we are seeing now. It's such a dry weather, and so hot, and then so cold, changing a lot. So I also think, and I will end with it, about Beatriz Nascimento, that we talked about her a lot in Biennale International Biennale of Architecture in São Paulo. That was a history woman. She was from history, and she thought about these quilombos and how black people were body documents. So each body is documenting and is bringing its history. It exists a documentary talking about her way of thinking and thinking about these quilombos and these bodies trying to escape and trying to create strategies to survive, and also to not only to survive but to live, like to make parties. In Brazil we also have this, so I went like that, like we have a lot of big parties, carnivals, and a lot of cultural movements that are still resisting and existing beyond resisting, existing, So this is it.
Margarida.
I think what I can point to somehow is that I come from a somehow deeply political and militant practice that kind of started off by my affiliation with the funambulist, and somehow thinking around questions of space, but also the urbanization of the built environment, and also I think another dimension somehow is that I'm also a child of militants. I'm a child of separatists. I'm a child of poets. I kind of love to kind of describe my lineage as a lineage of spiritual leaders, I would call them, of storytellers, I would call them. Today we use the term priests. They are formally trained as priests, but it kind of extends throughout generations. So somehow these two strands, or somehow what I use to advance my work, but also to define my work. And I think the most important thing for me and the most useful thing for me is to think through these two strands in relation to how I navigate the world as an architect, as a practitioner, as a Black woman architect that mostly operate in the Nordics, in Europe, and of course, as I started mentioning, that I'm also kind of a person whose existence is conditioned by the continuum of extractivism. So what does it mean to practice in an unextractive way that kind of expands beyond across scales, across the ways in which I enter into collaboration with peers, with colleagues, the ways in which I work with materials, the ways in which I develop I develop my work. So I think somehow that's potentially the way that I see myself as a practitioner, or where I aspire to be to some extent. And then also, I think one last thing is that I don't believe in the notion of a singular authorship or single authorship in relation to architecture. I think that it's always a collaborative praxis, and it's relational. So that's also something that I really bring with me, collaboration as an aspect that is so important and deeply ingrained in my practice.
Then Yolande, you go.
I want to be a practitioner that brings joy, because our past is very hard, and we know that our present is very hard. So in Brazil, we are always reminded that we are black people in a bad way. And the years pass, and I want joy to my life and the people who live with me. And in Brazil, we also have, I will say, crazy education, because we study just white and intellectuals. And I want to be more close to black intellectuals, black practitioners. This is very, very, very important to me. And it's happening these last 5-6 years that we've been working together. So I want to bring joy to the people of the African diaspora. It's very, very, very important to me. And I want to learn until I die. This is two things that I can easily think when I think what kind of practitioner I want to be.
It's a great answer, yeah. Yolande.
So I think, well, I'm kind of thinking of the first time we met, which was in the 1990s.
Long time.
In my studio space, I was in a residency program, and Lesley visited, and you were working on, I think it was before your book project, but you were kind of working toward white papers, black marks, and I was very much creating a practice at that time, and trying to figure out how it could be an architectural practice, like sort of fighting to have it be an architectural practice. And I feel like I have made it an architectural practice. One of the things that I kind of think about now, maybe worry, like I have a slight worry, which is that I do see more people embracing these questions in architectural discourse, and that is great. But I also, because I'm older, have seen cycles where things become important and popular and then they go away. And I also lived through a period where, because I've been doing the same thing, I lived through a period where I couldn't even talk about it with people in architecture because it was all about boys in space. And that's like when the millennium came, everything was about new technologies, it was about, digitization, it was just, nothing about social issues. And then it's interesting, from that we went into, everyone can acknowledge social issues now. So I think I don't want this to be a fad. Like, it's too important to be a fad, and but architecture is kind of prone to fads, so that's my worry. But then I do think, like, the scale of the work, like there are so many people involved with the work that that it will be hard to make it a fad. But that's just, something that I, kind of think about. In terms of like putting my practice forward and what I'd like to project, I'm really, really, well, the quote that I mentioned before from the text you gave us about, the term was a practice of presence. I use that to kind of challenge myself, because one of the biggest questions, like criticisms I get in my work, is who is my audience, and the work is very abstract. right? So I deal with data, I deal with representing things that are not visible. Architecture is based on tangible, material, physical things, but when it comes to the history of Blacks and others, there's a lack of physical things because they were not valued. And so then you have to find ways to make them present. You know, and that's like stepping outside of the discipline, looking at, and this happens across disciplines, like looking at literature or bills of sale or, you know, artifacts that are not necessarily buildings, you know, as a way to tell a story about buildings and the city. So, you know, that's again the past, but just thinking about like the way that Achille Mbembe talks about practice of presence is about wedding the practice into the experiences of people whose experiences are not valued. You know, so, you know, students who don't see themselves in the architectural canon, how can their presence, their experience of reality, you know, how can that be a theoretical ground, you know, to stand on? And I think it can. Like, we do have some examples of, and you have to piece the parts together of how you can make a practice based on what right now are alternative modes of presence. So that's kind of what I'm challenging myself to think about. I think materiality in my work has been one way that while it's abstract, when it's built, the way that the materials engage light and time and even the way that people have to read the work, they can't just, well, you can walk through it, but if you read it, you get something totally different than if you just walk through it. So I think there are these, you know, these other modes that I can't really see right now that I'd like to focus on.
So just to kind of wrap it up in a way, but to close it, I've been asked this question many times over the past sort of 6-8 weeks. You know, what did you take away from the Biennale? And I would have to say that even though I think I'm too close to it to judge it, one really undeniable fact has emerged from it, which is the power of imagination. So both the restrictions that we placed on participants, don't bring staff, find other ways to represent ideas, but also the license that we gave to people, do what is authentic to you, has brought together work of a kind of imaginative dimension that I didn't for a minute expect. So for me, going back through the exhibits, you know, every other week, I can honestly say that at the end of the Arsenale or the Cordery or the Central Pavilion, I am blown away by the imagination. And that is such an intangible thing, but also so powerful. And that I think the exhibitors here have it in spades. Yeah. Great. Thank you. Thank you for coming. Thank you for that terrible journey. It's now time for a Chardonnay. Thank you. Thank you to the audience. Thank you for coming. And thank you. This is the last panel discussion. I want to say a special thank you to Ilaria. Take a bow. Who has worked tirelessly throughout this with me. So thank you. Thank you, Ilaria. And thank you to everybody else. And to the translators, to the technicians, ciao, grazie mille, and to everybody who has made this possible. So enjoy. Thank you.